Welcome to Resistance Live. Since 2017, Resistance Live has been the go-to home for political and legal news and analysis through a decidedly progressive activist lens. I'm your host, Elizabeth Cronise McLaughlin. I'm a former Wall Street and human rights lawyer, a lifelong organizer, and a leadership and impact consultant for all those seeking to lead big progressive change in these incredibly challenging times. To get bonus broadcasts, ask questions, and more, don't forget to become a paid subscriber to the show at patreon.com/resistancelive. And to learn more about what we do to help progressive leaders everywhere, check out GaiaLeadershipProject.com. And now, here's today's show. Hey everybody! Well, it's a disgusting day. I wish I had better news that it was somehow a less disgusting day than it actually is, but it's really gross. And a lot of the things that we have to talk about today on the 18th of November are really foul. So let's just set the stage for where we are now. We are awaiting a vote on the Epstein Files Transparency Act, really kind of like at any minute. This morning we had an enormous group of Epstein survivors give a press conference on the steps of the Capitol. And just minutes before I went on the air, Mike Johnson gave a press conference about his position on the Epstein Files Transparency Act. He is, in fact, going to vote to release the Epstein files. This, in my opinion, is one of the biggest cover your ass moments in American history, because let's not forget, this is a man who refused to seat an elected representative in the House of Representatives for close to 60 days because he didn't want to give the Democrats the deciding vote they needed to bring the Epstein Files Transparency Act to the floor of the House. So the fact that he is now voting for it is a sign of how deep the GOP is in the mud over this issue. Now, I do want to mention to everyone, because there was some questions about this on the Patreon feed this morning, that Mike Johnson, in this presser that just wound down a few minutes ago, was claiming that when this bill gets to the Senate, he thinks Thune, as the Senate Majority Leader, is going to suggest some revisions. And there were questions about what that actually meant. So let me just explain this to everybody. I did a whole broadcast yesterday on what's contained in the act in its current form. This is what Mike Johnson is worried about. Okay, there are two things. And he actually alluded to the first one I'm going to describe just a few minutes ago. Okay, what the act does, other than requiring the release of the Epstein files, is it sets certain conditions on their release. The first is that no redactions of identity are allowed for the sake of protecting someone's reputation. All right. So what that means is that associates of Epstein's, potentially like other perpetrators of sexual abuse and trafficking, people who knew him, who lauded him, who hung out with him, who went to his house, none of their name, or house says, none of their names may be redacted from the files under the current version of the act. Now, Mike Johnson is very up in arms about this morning. Oh, innocent people could be deemed, suffer consequences just by their association with Epstein. So what? I'm sorry, but if you didn't know enough after Epstein's initial conviction for soliciting a minor for sex all the way back in 2007, that this was a person that you shouldn't be associating with, you deserve what's coming to you. So that's the first issue that he is concerned about. The second issue that he is concerned about is this. He is concerned about the fact that, and there's an enormous amount of disinformation and doomsaying about this, so I want to make it really clear. I have mentioned this now on 3 broadcasts, so please pay attention. He is concerned about the fact that the Epstein Files Transparency Act, as currently written, does not, let me say this again, does not allow for all the files to be withheld on the basis of an ongoing investigation. This one is for all of you who seem to think, because there are a lot of you out there in this audience, unfortunately, who seem to think that Trump is engineering a means by which he can withhold all the Epstein files. The current draft of the Epstein Files Transparency Act provides that files can only be withheld on the basis of an ongoing investigation if they are narrowly tailored and temporarily withheld. And in addition to that, if a log of each and every every document by identification and by basis for withholding is provided to Congress within 15 days. So this act does not allow Trump to say, there's an ongoing investigation in the DOJ on the basis of Bill Clinton having known Jeffrey Epstein. All the files cannot be disclosed. That's not permissible under this act. It's not permissible. Okay? So these are the two things that Mike Johnson is worried about. Now, let me say one thing about this. They're really playing with fire with this one, because we're in a situation now, we have to look at like the long-term view of what's happened here. It was back in early July, like late June, it started to be signaled early July that Pam Bondi claimed the Epstein files didn't even exist, okay? Since that time, across multiple press conferences by survivors, across a bipartisan effort to have these files released, and all of these shenanigans to try to prevent the vote on this act from coming to the floor, we have now reached a pinnacle moment where the public pressure is so great that it is not outside the realm of possibility that we will have a unanimous Republican vote in favor of releasing the files today in the House, okay? That is an extraordinary win for the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein, okay? The idea that the GOP now wants to F with the terms of this act so that people who are implicated with Epstein can safely avoid accountability, the idea that they want to give Trump an out to prevent these files from being disclosed to the public, that is not going to sit well with everyone. And I'm just going to remind everybody, there's polling on this. 81% of Americans believe that Donald Trump is hiding something with regard to the Epstein files. This is not going to sit well with the general public if they start trying to mess with it. All right. So it's a very dangerous moment for the GOP. And frankly, I welcome it, because the other thing I have to remind you all of is that there are other fractures happening in other places inside MAGA right now. There's a huge ongoing scandal about Tucker Carlson's endorsement of Nick Fuentes, who is a Holocaust-denying neo-Nazi. There are huge shifts happening in the bro podcaster space. We've seen just in the last 24 hours, big name white male bro podcasters who have historically been MAGA calling this moment as the end of the Make America Great Again movement. So they are dealing with huge fractures on their side of the fence, some of which are being fostered, frankly, created even by the actions of the GOP with regard to the Epstein files. So messing with this is not a solution for them. And I also just want to point out here that if it passes the House and it passes the Senate, it still has to go to Trump's desk to be signed. And if he doesn't sign it, it looks like, I mean, I've been calling this now for like 3 days. It looks like we might have veto-proof majorities in both the House and the Senate, meaning it could become law anyway. So I think that, you know, the GOP is in a really precarious position right now. That's very good news for us, right? I have a video coming on this next Monday, but this is an organizing opportunity, right? This is a chance to really maximize on the fractures in the MAGA base and to really fill that with great progressive candidates and progressive messaging. So you can wait for my educational video on that next Monday, but I'm just going to tell you all, like, huge opportunities presenting right now as MAGA starts to crumble. All right. I also just want to mention something, particularly when it comes to this issue of like scandal reaching other people. So many of you may know by now that Larry Summers, who used to be the president of Harvard, has always been routinely sexist, right? Like back in 2005, when I, was a young lawyer, many of the people that I knew were outraged because he claimed that women weren't smart enough to succeed in math and science. Okay. He's still employed at Harvard. And one of the things that came out in these files that were released from the Epstein estate late last week is that he was seeking advice from Jeffrey Epstein on how he could have sex with one of his graduate students. There are explicit mentions of like his fantasies about this woman that he was supposed to be mentoring. So again, one of the things that I just have to point out here is that there are consequences falling. Now, Larry Summers is still employed by Harvard. He is still teaching at Harvard. He has stepped away from certain leadership roles in the last 24 hours, but they have not fired him. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind here is that the public pressure around this on people who enabled Epstein, who were a part of his inner circle, who exhibited profoundly poor judgment in their dealings with him, and who revealed themselves to be part of this, cut from the same cloth, part of the same ilk, right? Larry Summers was friends with Jeffrey Epstein for like decades. I have really serious questions about what he was doing on all those many dinners that he had with Epstein, his trips to the island, right? These things need to be investigated. The public and the survivors are owed the truth about the people who were involved with Epstein and not just Epstein's crimes themselves. So it is really important that we keep the pressure up here. And again, I talked yesterday about the fact that the narrow version of accountability that we think about in the United States, which really basically for most people just means throwing somebody in jail, is actually not the extent of what needs to happen here. Because there are statutes of limitation, people may not be prosecuted, but we really need to think about, like, what are the moral limits that we're going to set around acceptable conduct for men in leadership positions in this country, whether that's in government, in academia, in the sciences, in journalism. What are the standards that we're going to set? How are we, as people with power, reminder, going to hold these people accountable professionally and personally so that they are tarred forever by their association with the nation's most notorious sex trafficking pedophile? They should be tarred forever with it. And Mike Johnson now wants to protect those men. That's really what he's after, up to and including the president of the United States. So very questionable conduct today. All right. I also just want to mention that the survivors conference this morning was really powerful and moving. Virginia Giuffre's brother spoke about the fact that Trump and the GOP were using his sister's memory as a political tool and how wrong that was, that the trauma is real, that the survivors deserve justice. And again, we saw some survivors who actually voted for Trump speaking out against what the administration has done. So you can watch that. There's footage of it everywhere. I have some clips of it posted on my Blue Sky. Strongly encourage a watch of that if you have the stomach for it, because it really does, with hundreds of women, behind a podium, make very clear the scope of what we're dealing with here. Okay. In other sex trafficking news, not that we needed more of it, there was a breaking story this morning that Customs and Border Patrol, which, by the way, notwithstanding the fact that they're only supposed to operate within 100 miles of the U.S. border, are currently deploying operations in Raleigh and Charlotte, North Carolina. Shout out to everybody in Raleigh and Charlotte who's organizing against this. There have been great protests and a lot of local movement mirroring some of the things that have been happening in Chicago. The Tate brothers, who all of you may know, who are like notorious rapists and sex traffickers themselves, prosecuted in multiple international jurisdictions, right? Accusations all over Europe. You may remember that they returned to the United States, to Florida specifically, earlier on in the Trump regime, okay? CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, which detained them upon their arrival, was convinced by a Department of Homeland Security official who has referred to himself as having a Nazi flavor. CBP was influenced by that particular official, Paul Ingracia, I believe is his name, to return to the Tate brothers the devices that were seized by CBP when they entered the country so that they could go about their lives inside the United States. So let me just mention something here, okay? Because you've heard me say many times here that hypocrisy doesn't work on MAGA, because what they're really about is hierarchy. What they are saying is the chosen few, the rapists, the pedophiles, the people who we know and who are powerful and rich and famous, can live above the law. And the rest of you are subject to the law when and how we say you are, okay? So this is an example of that, right? The Tate brothers are like world famous influencers, so to speak, in the manosphere realm of the internet. Really dark, disgusting stuff, okay? And lots of people in Trump's inner circle happen to like these guys. And so they get benefits from Customs and Border Patrol that would not be extended to the average home construction worker in any part of the United States who's done nothing wrong. Okay? Again, I have to point out, it's not good for this regime to have Trump and his people giving special privileges to sex traffickers at a moment where we're all waiting to find out the totality of the evidence against Donald Trump in Jeffrey Epstein's files. So again, really vile moment. I warned you all at the top. This was not going to be this is kind of the theme of the day is gross. This is gross. This is gross. Speaking of gross, we have another breaking scandal today because yesterday on Air Force One, and I hesitate to even repeat this because it's so vile, Trump was asked a question by a female Bloomberg reporter. I believe it was actually related to the Epstein files. And he looked at her and said, quiet, piggy. And rather than any other reporter asking the question again, or any other reporter who was there saying to the president, that's not acceptable, you can't talk to her that way, they all just went on as normal. So I want to say two things about this. Trump has a history of using that particular language against women he doesn't like, Rosie O'Donnell in particular. But this isn't the first time that we've seen him use that language in relation to a woman. But second of all, I have to point out something else really significant here. He did a speech last night at a McDonald's event where, I tried to follow the footage on this, literally was basically incoherent for huge chunks of that speech. Went from talking about the engines on planes to water pressure in the shower to the Iran nuclear deal, all in the space of about 2 minutes, with no logical coherence between any of his thoughts. And so I just want to point out to everyone that one of the main symptoms of advancing Alzheimer's dementia is the falling away of any kind of social norms or limits on the kinds of insults that you will put out there into the world. Okay, I happen to know this. Thankfully, it's not in my own family, but I know this from a friend whose mother passed away from Alzheimer's, that, this kind of level of all bets are off, all abuse flows freely is a common symptom of advancing Alzheimer's. And so this in and of itself, we're seeing a greater and greater degradation of his mental health and capacity. This event also, in addition to the fact that it is emblematic of his ongoing virulent misogyny throughout his entire life, is also a sign of him doing something that, in the context of a press gaggle on Air Force One, in front of rolling cameras and dozens of reporters, we haven't seen him do before. Okay, so it's both at once. And the thing to take away from it, of course, in addition to the fact that it is wildly offensive, I had to kind of gag on the words when I was thinking about just even speaking it on today's broadcast, is that it is emblematic of his lack of mental control at this point. So yeah, I wish I didn't have to talk about it. And I feel for that reporter. And it's also not the first time he's levied abuse at reporters, particularly Black women reporters. This one is quite another level up from what we have seen in the past. Okay, so we had a development in the case against Jim Comey yesterday that I was asked to talk about by some of our followers on the Patreon feed. So here's what happened. Yesterday, there was a hearing in the Eastern District of Virginia where, of course, Jim Comey has been indicted allegedly for lying to Congress. And some of you may recall that this indictment was brought by the interim U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, who was appointed by Trump after the original U.S. attorney in that district refused to follow Trump's orders and start indicting Trump's political enemies. And there was a long discussion inside this office about the fact that there was insufficient evidence to indict Jim Comey. And then lo and behold, Trump's appointed U.S. attorney presented an indictment to the court. This is where things get funky, okay? Because it turns out that in addition to the fact that this U.S. attorney, who, by the way, is not a criminal prosecutor, has done work apparently in the insurance law arena prior to this. In addition to the fact that she apparently dismissed the court reporter for the grand jury, which you do not do. That would be my bar license if I ever did that. Okay. Apparently, there is also a possibility here that she presented an indictment to the court that was not agreed to by the grand jury in question. And so this particular judge, seeing all of this outrageous conduct by this Trump-appointed U.S. attorney, has now ordered all of the materials that were presented to the grand jury to be turned over to Comey's attorneys. and raised the specter of the fact that there were vast improprieties in the way that this case came to pass. Okay. So one of the things that that's going to do is it's going to give Jim Comey's attorneys ammunition to seek to dismiss the case. And more power to him is all I have to say about that. I have thought from the very beginning, having watched even the footage where he is accused of lying to Congress on the basis of very vague questioning by Ted Cruz, that it was highly unlikely that they would ever get a jury conviction from this, let alone an effective indictment, right? So huge questions about this. And it's something to watch, okay? Because personally, I think it is a very strong possibility that the judge in this case and in the Tish James case is going to kick these cases straight out of court. Okay, speaking of kicking cases out of court, we do have one bit of good news from yesterday, which is that, just to back up for a second, there is a law in New York State called the New York Protect Our Courts Act. And what it does is it prevents ICE from coming into state courthouses, not federal. I have to remind you all, there's two, okay? State courthouses to arrest people on the basis of alleged immigration violations, all right? So we've all seen this happen in federal immigration court. Again, downtown New York City, in the courthouses where I used to practice when I was in federal court, this has been happening nonstop. People show up for immigration hearings. The immigration judges, who are not employed, by the way, by the judicial branch, they are agents of the executive branch. They will dismiss the immigration case. That leaves a person without status. They walk outside the courtroom and ICE swoops them up, okay? Again, it's a setup. This is not the way that our system ordinarily has worked prior to now. Well, New York State, not federal, has passed a law that says ICE is not allowed in federal courthouses. If you come to state court, let's say you're a domestic violence victim, and you are seeking a state protective order against the person who has harmed you, ICE cannot arrest you at that hearing. You go into state court on a child custody matter, ICE cannot arrest you at that hearing. You go into court, to procure a divorce or on a small claims challenge because your employer hasn't paid you overtime, ICE cannot arrest you at that courthouse. So the Trump administration challenged that act in court. Why are we surprised? Took the New York State AG to, and actually I think it was just like New York State generally under the imprimatur of the governor, to federal court to try to invalidate this act in New York State courthouses. And yesterday they lost. Not just they are actually already lost at the lower level, and now they've lost in the appellate court. And it was like a fairly scathing decision by a panel of judges who simply were not having this at all. So I have to remind you all that victories continue to happen. It's very important that we don't lose sight of those victories in the face of all this monstrosity that we are dealing with right now with the Epstein files and everything else. There are cracks in the armor. They are growing every day. The legitimacy of the MAGA movement is deeply in question right now, and not just among people like us who have always been opposed to it. And the impact of all this chipping away through the Epstein files, through, again, Tucker Carlson's endorsement of a Holocaust denier, through these court victories, which, are routinely at this point being won, is a big deal. Another court this morning dismissed Trump's case against CNN. That case, again, appellate court decision, 2 of the 3 judges on the bench were Trump appointees. And they were like, this case has no merit. You cannot sue CNN for reporting this. So once again, I just want to point out that we are winning. And I know it doesn't feel like it all the time, but we are winning. And that is all the more reason why, if you have not yet gotten engaged locally where you live in organizing efforts to protect and save lives in some format, whether that's like immigration defense, whether it's in the context of working to protect trans kids, whether it's in the context of fighting for gun safety or abortion rights or working on behalf of progressive candidates, you need to do that right now. Okay. And again, if you live in a community that is currently being targeted by ICE, you need to get involved immediately in whistle campaigns, in rapid response, in making sure that you are doing defense work, in running errands for people who are afraid to leave their homes. There's so many ways to get involved right now, but progress is being made. And it's really important that we don't miss it. Okay. Final thing I have to talk about today, because there were some questions about it on the feed, is this entire scandal that appears to be very gossipy, but really is about much larger things, involving Olivia Nuzzi, who was the reporter for New York Magazine who had the affair with RFK Jr., Her longtime partner, who's no longer with her, Ryan Lizza, also a reporter, and she's just written a book. And Lizza last night put out on his Substack an absolutely scathing piece that revealed that on top of the fact that Olivia Nuzzi had had an affair with RFK Jr., she had also slept with Mark Sanford. He who was apparently away on the Appalachian Trail when he was cheating on his wife back when he was running for president. Does everybody remember this? And this has raised kind of like, especially amongst like intellectual and journalistic folks, you know, again, this is like the population of larger accounts on Blue Sky. Huge questions. All right. But I have to mention one other thing here because somebody asked me, do I have to pay attention to this? And I'm just going to say something about this that I think is really relevant. Okay. What people may not have realized is that Olivia Nuzzi, who, by the way, has now landed this plush job at Vanity Fair despite sleeping with her sources, whole huge questions about that. She was involved with Keith Olbermann before this, before she was 21 years old. And she left Keith Olbermann with the help of Ryan Lizza because Keith Olbermann was allegedly stalking her. Keith Olbermann is out this morning basically shitting the bed about all of this, claiming that he looks good in the reporting so far, that he did nothing wrong, even though he was 34 years older than her and she wasn't old enough to drink when they got together. So one of the things that I just have to make clear right now is that there is a moment, much like what happened in the early days of Me Too, where the veil is really being lifted on the behavior of appalling men. And I don't need anybody to be following the ins and outs of Ryan Lizza and Olivia Nuzzi's breakup, okay? But I do want to point out that the consistencies across this story, similar to the consistencies across the Epstein story, are about powerful older men who have engaged in, at the very least, deeply questionable behavior with very young women. And by the way, Ryan Lizza is not exempt from this. When he got together with Olivia Nuzzi, he was like, I don't know, something like 20 years older than her, 18 years older than her. So again, you know, there are things, notwithstanding the fact that she is not a very good person. Like, I'm not going to give her any cred because she did a lot of things that were deeply unethical. And I can't believe she's landed as like the Vanity Fair West Coast editor as a result of this. That's crazy. There are plenty of other great journalists that deserve that job. Nonetheless, it's really important for people to recognize that there is this ongoing thing happening right now of elite white men being revealed to be, no shocker in all of this, truly terrible people willing to exploit young women for their own aims. All right. And again, you don't have to follow the ins and outs and the details and the scandal and the gossipy nature of this. But I do think it's really important to understand that the through line of this is very powerful, older, largely politically oriented men taking advantage of younger women. And that is not excusing, again, any of Olivia Nuzzi's participation or behavior in all of this, but I want people to notice that, okay? Because one of the things that came up in the Epstein files when I was reviewing them last week is all the complaining that Epstein and his friends had to say about the Me Too movement and how all of their friends were being brought down. Brett Ratner, Harvey Weinstein, Woody Allen, more. And if you read through those emails, what you find is them all being like, this isn't going to end until like everybody's brought down. And can't a guy just kind of like have a relationship when he feels like it? And I have to say, you know, we can talk a lot about the end of Me Too and why it came to be the way that it was, but the lack of accountability for men like this is a big chunk of how we landed here, right? That none of the men, save maybe Harvey Weinstein, right, who were brought to account as a result of this. And there's a few others that ended up in prison. I'm thinking of like the guy who was the international model recruiter who was accused of multiple counts of rape. Nonetheless, most of those men were in fact not canceled. Most of those men experienced like a momentary blip of professional accountability. Louis C.K. is still touring, right? And no other accountability at all, okay? So I said it this morning, and, you know, I'm just going to say it here again. I'm very much in the place right now where I'm like, it's time for Me Too 2.0, this time with revenge. And what I mean by that is actual accountability. Because men who do this, right, like men who participated with Epstein, men who have participated in exploiting young women, men who have like done these things and think they're off scot-free or they didn't do anything wrong, like this is a moment where we as a culture and a society get to decide what's acceptable. And that's on all of us to participate in. It's a moment where we all actually need to make our voices heard about these sorts of things. And again, more than just saying that Epstein was disgusting, more than just posting about it on social media, but actually saying, right, to your friends, your neighbors, people who are talking about these issues, we have to find a way to make sure this never happens again, right? And that's beyond criminal accountability. Like I have to point this out. There's no question that what Epstein did was criminal, okay? But the issue that is really at the heart of this is the access and the power and the looking the other way that was given to him by some of the most powerful men in the world, the way in which he catered to the needs of elite men for connection. Steve Bannon, for God's sake, right? You know, the way that there is an intersection here of just a lack of total accountability for a certain class of very wealthy, protected, powerful men. We get to decide whether or not we think that's okay. And that's part of what's happening on the Hill today. So again, I just have to remind you all, the Epstein Files Transparency Act is coming up for a vote in the Senate next. You need to call your senators. You need to call your senators, especially if they're MAGA, and demand the release of the files. Furthermore, based on what Mike Johnson said right before I went on the air, you should call them and tell them that you want it passed in the exact form that it is passed in the House. No redactions of associates of Epstein. No protection for the people who enabled him. The only names that should be redacted from that are the victims, and there should be no ability whatsoever to protect those files because of an ongoing investigation. So again, really important to make your voice heard on this today, okay? I think we are going to see a sweeping win on this bill in the House. It is promptly going to go to the Senate. We need to make sure that what Johnson is signaling does not happen. And that's up to us. We have to make our voices heard. So go make your phone calls. All right, everybody? I will be back here regular time again tomorrow. Please support this show by becoming a subscriber over on Patreon for as little as $5 a month. We do have an ongoing promotion using the code FALL2025 to get 20% off annual subscriptions. But that subscription is what allows me to do this because this is not my day job, okay? Every single time I spend doing this takes away from like the ways in which I actually make money. So please subscribe to the Patreon feed to support this work. If you appreciate what I'm doing here, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Give us a thumbs up. If you're listening on a podcasting format, please give us a positive review on the platform where you're listening and subscribe. And I will catch you all back here tomorrow at regular time. Thanks to many of our new watchers. We've had a lot of new listeners in the last couple of days. Welcome. We're glad to see you here. We're going on 9 years of doing this. Nice to have you. And I will catch you all back here tomorrow. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good rest of your day. Bye. Make your phone calls. That's our show for today, folks. Thanks so much for being here at Resistance Live. To get more out of the show, including bonus broadcasts, the answers to all your most pressing political and legal questions, and way more, head on over to patreon.com/resistancelive and become a paid subscriber. And don't forget to hit subscribe here on your favorite podcasting platform to make sure that you never miss an episode. See you next time.